Convinced that America was falling into decadence and decline now that the frontier was gone, the so-called progressives, under the leadership of Teddy Roosevelt and the Eastern financial elites, fixed their sights on the goal of carving out an overseas empire. Their eyes naturally fell upon Hawaii, Cuba, and the other Caribbean islands. The so-called frontier thesis was highly influential, as were the writings of Alfred Thayer Macan, the author of Sea Power's Influence Upon History, which made the argument that a great navy was the signature of national greatness. This was grist for the mill of a growing pro-imperialist movement, which lobbied for a navy that would project American power across the Pacific and southward into Latin America. When the sugar barons agitated for the annexation of Hawaii, then President Grover Cleveland managed to derail the move, but the annexationists persisted, and the issue soon became the subject of a national debate. On one side were the imperialists, who wanted to follow the path of Great Britain and inherit the mantle of empire. On the other side were the heirs of Jefferson and Washington, who upheld the policy of non-intervention because they saw it as the path to internal corruption, both moral and material. While President Cleveland rejected the entreaties of the interventionists in regards to taking Hawaii, the empire builders had more success with William McKinley, whose presidency saw the outbreak of the Spanish-American War and the entry of America into the realm of empire. With Hawaii already flying the American flag, Teddy Roosevelt and his allies in Congress moved quickly and aggressively to make the case for seizing Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Roosevelt and his self-described progressives saw this as their chance to achieve national greatness for America, and also, in a very condescending way, to uplift the so-called savage peoples of tropical lands for their own good, of course. The imperialist impulse was the logical extension of the so-called progressive doctrine that a more activist government that Americans were inclined to tolerate was a good thing abroad as well as at home. Government, they believed, could be the instrument of virtue overseas as well as on the home front, and what is more nakedly an instrument of government than its armed forces. These were new and radical ideas, one which the conservatives of the time, mostly in the South, as well as the classical liberals in the Northwest found appalling. So these disparate opponents of empire gathered together in a movement founded not far from here in Boston's Faneuil Hall in 1898. Now they had trouble getting the hall at first for fear of being targeted by pro-war mobs, but in the end they overcame the objections and they managed to secure the hall and held a meeting at which a number of prominent Bostonians spoke and presided over by a man by the name of Gamaliel Bradford, known as America's preeminent biographer, who declared, quote, "To seize any colony of Spain and hold it as our own without the free consent of its people is a violation of the principles upon which this government rests, which we have preached to the world for a century and which we pledged ourselves to respect when this war was declared. But the case does not end here. We not only abandoned the boasted Monroe Doctrine, we not only disregard that wise policy of non-intervention in European troubles, which Washington taught and until now we have followed. We become a military power, burdened with a standing army and an enormous navy, threatened with complications thousands of miles away and exposed to constant apprehension. Our domestic difficulties will be neglected, for our attention will be divided. Our taxation must increase, our currency become more disordered, And worst of all, the corruption which threatens us cannot fail to spread. And he meant political corruption. The Reverend Mr. Charles Ames, Unitarian clergyman of Dorchester, Massachusetts, rose at the meeting to contend, quote, that colonialism threatened to poison the blood of all liberty-loving peoples and to challenge their temper into a permanent attitude of arrogance, testiness, and defiance toward other nations. Certainly testiness really sort of says it all, doesn't it? Which would end badly for the United States, he predicted. Now, this founding meeting gave rise to a national organization, the Anti-Imperialist League, which spread westward all the way to the Central Plains of the Midwest and further on to California, with 50,000 members enrolled. Gold Democrats, conservative businessmen, country farmers, and New England mugwumps, kind of a liberal, joined together in a national movement to oppose the rise of an American empire. The views of these Jeffersonians, to use Walter Mead's useful category, were summed up by Carl Schurz, a U.S. senator and a force in the Republican Party of his day, when he argued, quote, if we take these new regions, we shall be well entangled in that contest for territorial aggrandizement which distracts other nations and drives them beyond their original design. So it will be inevitably with us. We shall want new conquests to protect that which we already possess. The greed of speculators working upon our government will push us from one point to another, and we shall have new conflicts upon our hands, almost without knowing how we got them, end quote. His prophecy is our reality. Perhaps then we can draw some lessons from the movement he helped to found. If we look at the political character, that is the views of the anti-imperialists and their pro-imperialist enemies, we can see that they did not adhere to traditional categories of left and right, or divide along party lines. Both factions of the Democratic Party, followers of William Jennings Bryan and the Cleveland Gold Democrats, who supported the gold standard, were generally opposed to the policy of imperialism, with the Bryanites more fervent in their opposition to overseas wars. On the Republican side, we had the party establishment and the so-called progressive wing, led by Teddy Roosevelt, who were jingoists, that is, pro-imperialists, while others, such as the mugwumps up here in New England, among the original founders, by the way, of the Republican Party, made up an important part of the anti-war, anti-imperialist coalition. So you can see the politics were very different back then. It wasn't red and blue, it was more complicated. The heirs of Jefferson persisted in their critique of empire as the nation faced the bloody spectacle of the First World War, and the progressives of Teddy Roosevelt's war party took up their positions in favor of entering the European slaughter. They launched a tremendous drive to prepare for war by expanding the Navy, which was met by the anti-imperialists with arguments against militarism and interventionism that owed much to the rhetoric of their predecessors. President Woodrow Wilson, the quintessential progressive, backed the campaign for a bigger military, but it was an embarrassment to the president that much of the opposition to his program was coming from within the ranks of his own Democratic